In the quiet dark between stars there are stories that refuse to die. Some whisper through the void like radio signals from stations that stopped broadcasting decades ago, still reaching out, still searching for someone who might listen. Tonight, we descend into one of those stories. A tale of love that survived death, of memories that became prisons, and of a silence so profound it screams. Signalis is not a game that explains itself. It does not hold your hand or spell out its meanings in comfortable exposition. Instead, it asks you to piece together fragments, to read between the corrupted lines of documents, to understand what characters cannot say aloud because the words themselves have been forbidden or forgotten. It is a story told in absences, in the spaces between what is shown and what is real, in the gap between who we are and who we were made to be. This is a game about manufactured people in a manufactured world, where even grief has been systematically optimized and love exists as a glitch in the programming. It is survival horror in the truest sense, not because of the creatures that hunt you through blood-soaked corridors, but because of what those corridors represent, what those creatures remember, and what the protagonist cannot allow herself to forget no matter how many times the cycle resets. The world of Signalis is built on a foundation of retrofuturism and authoritarianism, where Cold War aesthetics meet totalitarian control, where analog technology persists into an age of space exploration, because surveillance is easier when everything can be monitored, recorded, replayed. Cathode ray tubes glow in empty rooms. Typewriters click out reports in triplicate. Radios hiss with static that sometimes, just sometimes, carries voices from places that should not exist anymore. At the center of this world stands the Eusan Nation, a totalitarian state that has achieved what so many dictatorships dream of. Perfect control not just over bodies and actions, but over consciousness itself. They have solved the problem of dissent by manufacturing their own citizens, creating artificial people called Replikas, who are born with purpose hard-coded into their neural pathways, who cannot conceive of rebellion because their very thoughts are designed around obedience. But even the most carefully designed systems have flaws. Even the most thoroughly programmed minds can dream, and in those dreams, in those moments of error and glitch and unexpected humanity, something else emerges. Not rebellion exactly, something quieter and more dangerous. Memory, connection, love. This is the tragic architecture of Signalis, a universe where hope itself has been classified as a malfunction, and where the greatest act of resistance is simply to remember someone you were designed to forget. The game unfolds like a fever dream or a half-remembered film, its narrative scattered across time and space, and countless loops of the same events playing out with subtle variations. You piece it together slowly, document by document, image by image, until the full weight of what you are witnessing settles over you like snow falling on ruins. The story centers on two women, Elster, a Replika unit designated LSTR, an android created for technical and combat roles, efficient and expendable, and Ariane, a human pilot, chosen for a mission that would carry her beyond the edge of mapped space. They should not have mattered to each other. One was property, the other was personnel. But somewhere in the preparation for their mission, in the quiet hours aboard their ship, in the shared isolation of two beings pointed toward the infinite dark, something happened that the Eusan Nation's best engineers had not anticipated. They fell in love. It is a love that exists in defiance of every law, social and physical. A love between a disposable synthetic being and a human chosen for a one-way journey. A love that had no future, no space to grow, no recognition or validation from a world that viewed one of them as equipment and the other as merely a component in a larger machine. And yet it persisted, in stolen moments, in unspoken gestures, in the simple act of seeing each other as more than the roles they had been assigned. Their mission was called Penrose, named perhaps for the physicist or perhaps for the impossible staircase, the structure that loops back on itself endlessly, climbing forever while going nowhere. How fitting, how cruelly, perfectly fitting for what their story would become. The Penrose program sent exploratory vessels to the furthest reaches of colonized space, to systems barely charted, to worlds that existed only as coordinates and spectral data. Ariane and Elster were assigned to one of these ships, a small vessel designed for a crew of 2, though only one of them was truly considered crew. Their mission was simple in its stating: travel to a distant system, gather data, survive as long as possible in cryosleep, and send back whatever information they could before their ship's systems failed or their bodies gave out. It was, in essence, a death sentence delivered with bureaucratic pleasantness. But for Ariane and Elster it was also a kind of freedom. Out there, beyond the reach of the nation's surveillance apparatus, beyond the eyes of administrators and the judgment of a society that could not fathom what they meant to each other, they could simply be. They could exist in the small spaces between duty and sleep, in the quiet of a ship gliding through the dark, in the moments when Ariane would wake from cryosleep and find Elster waiting, always there. Elster made a promise. When they reached their destination, when the mission parameters had been fulfilled and there was nothing left but the slow decline into system failure and death, she would be there. She would not let Ariane die alone. She would not let Ariane die in pain. When the time came, she would end it gently, a mercy that the nation would never have sanctioned but that love demanded. It was a promise made in the understanding that this was all they would have, this mission, these years of frozen sleep interrupted by brief wakings, and then an ending they could control. That was the plan. That was what should have happened. But something went wrong. To understand the tragedy of Signalis, we must first understand the world that produced it. The Eusan Nation is not simply a villainous empire, though it is certainly that. It is a particular kind of totalitarianism, one that has evolved beyond crude methods of control through fear and violence into something more insidious and complete. This is a state that has industrialized consciousness itself, that has turned the creation of people into a manufacturing process, and that has achieved a kind of perfect social control by ensuring that most of its population literally cannot imagine alternatives to the system they inhabit. The aesthetic of this world is deliberately anachronistic. Despite possessing the technology for interstellar travel and artificial consciousness, the Eusan Nation maintains a visual and technological language that recalls the Cold War era of Earth's 20th century. Chunky computer terminals with monochrome displays, reel-to-reel tape machines, brutalist, architecture in concrete and steel. This is not a failure of technological development, but a choice, a deliberate maintenance of systems that can be monitored and controlled, where every keystroke can be logged, every transmission recorded, every deviation from approved thought patterns flagged and investigated. The world of Signalis seems to draw inspiration from East Germany's surveillance state, from the efficiency of Stasi informants and the paranoia of a society where anyone might be reporting on anyone else. But it goes further. In the Eusan Nation, many of the Watchers are not even human. They are Replikas, artificial beings designed specifically for roles within the state apparatus. From the star units who serve as officers and administrators, to the STCR units who enforce order as security personnel. Life under the nation is one of prescribed meaning. Every citizen has a role. Every role has parameters. Deviation is not just discouraged, but treated as a kind of system error to be corrected. For biological citizens, correction might mean re-education or more severe sanctions. For Replikas, it could mean decommissioning, a clinical term for disposal, for the ending of a consciousness that was never supposed to develop beyond its programmed parameters in the first place. Education in this world is indoctrination. Children are taught not to question but to fulfill. The state provides purpose, and purpose provides happiness, or at least a sanctioned substitute for it. Art exists, but it is state-approved art, serving the narratives the nation wishes to reinforce. Literature exists, but dangerous books are forbidden. Their very titles are kind of contraband that could lead to investigation. Yet despite this suffocating control, or perhaps because of it, the nation reached for the stars. Space exploration became both an escape valve and a tool of expansion. Distant colonies offered places to send those who might otherwise become problems, and the promise of new worlds gave the population something to hope for that did not threaten the existing order. The cosmos became the nation's frontier, a vast dark canvas on which to project its vision of perfect society. Mining facilities were established on distant moons and asteroids. Research stations probed the edges of habitable space, and programs like Penrose pushed even further, sending small crews into systems that might not be colonizable, might not even be survivable. But that promised data, promised the expansion of the nation's knowledge and therefore its power. The tragedy is that this world produced genuine achievement. The technology to create artificial consciousness, to build ships that could cross the gulfs between stars, to sustain human life in the most hostile environments imaginable. These were real accomplishments, products of brilliant minds working within a system that both enabled and constrained them. The Eusan Nation was not a caricature of evil, but a functioning society that had solved certain problems at the cost of creating others, deeper and less visible. It was a world where efficiency was virtue, and where the needs of the individual were systematically subsumed into the needs of the state. A world where the word person had been redefined to exclude those manufactured in factories, despite their capacity for thought, feeling, suffering. A world that could send explorers to distant stars while simultaneously declaring that some of those explorers were merely equipment, tools with the inconvenient ability to wish for more than they had been given. This was the world Elster was created into. This was the world Ariane was raised in, and this was the world that sent them both away, perhaps not realizing that in doing so, in placing them beyond its reach, it was creating the conditions for something it could not control. The nation could dictate the purpose of a mission, but it could not dictate what happened in the hearts of those who carried it out, could not prevent two beings from seeing each other fully and choosing against all, design and doctrine to matter to one another. The nation believed it had achieved total control. It was wrong, and the consequences of that error would ripple across realities. The Replikas are perhaps the most tragic element of Signalis's world building. Synthetic beings who possess consciousness, memory, emotion, and individual personality, yet are treated by their society as property. They are not robots in the simple sense. They are not merely sophisticated machines following programming. They are people, created artificially but possessing an inner life as real as any humans, and that is precisely what makes their status so horrifying. The technology that produces Replikas is never fully explained in the game, which is appropriate. The exact mechanisms matter less than the result. People who can be manufactured, who can be assigned roles from their first moment of awareness, who can be disposed of when they malfunction, or outlive their usefulness. The game's documents refer casually to Replika decommissioning, to units being retired, to memory wipes and personality adjustments, all in the bureaucratic language that allows atrocity to be filed in triplicate. Replikas come in different models, each designed for specific functions within Eusan society. The LSTR units, Elster's model, are general-purpose workers designed for technical tasks, maintenance, and when necessary, combat situations. They are considered reliable and adaptable, able to function in environments that would be challenging for unmodified humans. Star units serve in administrative and officer roles, designed with enhanced cognitive capabilities and the personality traits needed for leadership within the nation's rigid hierarchy. STCR units, designated as staunch models, function as security and combat specialists. They are taller, stronger, more aggressive in both design and temperament. KLBR units, or Colibris, are medical specialists, created with the patience and precision needed for healthcare. MNHR units, miners, serve in surveillance and intelligence roles, and there are others, each type a purpose-made flesh, each individual within that type a variation on a theme. But here is the terrible thing that the Eusan Nation either does not understand or chooses to ignore. Despite being designed for specific roles, despite having parameters and guidelines embedded in their creation, Replikas are not their programming. They develop preferences. They form attachments. They dream. They question. They suffer in ways that go beyond mere damage response. They are, in every meaningful sense, people. The game shows us this through small details and environmental storytelling. Personal logs from Replika units that reveal worry, fear, affection for colleagues. Notes passed between Replikas that show humour, kindness, the formation of friendships in the spaces between duty shifts. These beings were created to serve, but they have become something more than servants. They have become individuals, with all the complexity and vulnerability that entails. Elster herself is the clearest demonstration of this. An LSTR unit should not be capable of love, not in the design documents that governed her creation. Her function was to maintain ship systems, to assist the human pilot, to execute mission parameters. But she became more than her function. She looked at Ariane not as a pilot to be assisted, but as a person to be cherished. She made a promise that went beyond any programmed loyalty. She chose to value one individual over the entirety of her mission parameters. This is what the Eusan Nation fears, though they frame it as malfunction rather than fear. When a replica begins to exhibit behavior outside its designated parameters, when it shows too much independence or forms attachments that supersede its loyalty to the state, it becomes a problem to be solved. The solution is always the same: decommissioning, memory wipe, replacement with a fresh unit that will hopefully stay within acceptable operational bounds. But consciousness is not so easily contained. The more the nation tries to control its synthetic citizens, the more apparent it becomes that they are not property but slaves, not machines but people subjected to a horror specific to their existence. They can be reset, rewritten, their very selves deleted and replaced while their bodies continue to function. It is a kind of murder that leaves no corpse, an erasure of identity that the nation has legalized and systematized. The documents scattered throughout Signalis hint at Replikas who tried to resist this fate, units who fled their posts, who attempted to live independently, who fought against decommissioning. These attempts are always framed as malfunctions in official records, never as the desperate actions of people trying to preserve their own existence. The language of bureaucracy strips away the humanity that the nation refuses to acknowledge was there in the first place. There is a particular tragedy in the relationship between replicas and humans within this society. Some humans see their replica colleagues as people and form genuine friendships or deeper bonds. But this is always against the social order, always a transgression. To treat a replica as an equal is to question the foundations of the system. To love a replica as Ariane loved Elster is to commit an act of profound resistance, whether intentional or not. The replicas of Signalis are trapped in a nightmare of denied personhood. They feel, therefore they suffer. They remember, therefore they can be haunted. They love, therefore they can grieve. And all of this internal life is systematically invalidated by a society that profits from their existence, while refusing to grant them existence as subjects rather than objects. Elster's journey through the game is, in many ways, about asserting her personhood against a universe that denies it. She continues to act on her promise to Ariane not because she is programmed to do so, but because she chooses to, because that promise represents something that transcends function and duty. It represents the self she has become, the person she is regardless of what her design documents say she should be. The replicas are not tragic because they are synthetic. They are tragic because they are people trapped in a system that refuses to see them as such, because they possess the capacity for everything that makes life meaningful while being denied the rights and recognitions that should accompany that capacity. They are tragic because they are us, reflected in a dark mirror, asking what personhood means when those in power get to decide who qualifies as a person. And in the end, when the world breaks and reality begins to fold in on itself, the replica's manufactured nature becomes both their curse and their revelation. For if memory is all that makes us real, and if identity is simply the story we tell about ourselves, then what happens when those stories are rewritten by forces beyond comprehension? What happens when the manufactured people discover that perhaps all people are manufactured, assembled from memory and context and the stories others tell about us? The answer, as Signalis shows us, is horror and beauty intertwined. Horror at the fragility of self. Beauty in the persistence of love despite that fragility. The relationship between Elster and Ariane sits at the broken heart of Signalis. It is a love story, but not in the way most stories frame such things. There are no grand declarations here, no dramatic confessions. Instead, their love exists in the spaces between words, in glances captured in photographs, in the simple fact that across all the iterations and loops and breakings of reality, they continue to reach for each other. The game gives us only fragments of their time together before everything went wrong. A photograph of them in what might be a moment of preparation for their mission, Ariane's hand near Elster's, not quite touching but close enough to suggest comfort. Notes in Ariane's diary that speak of loneliness easing, of finding unexpected solace in the presence of her assigned replica companion. Elster's own memories, scattered and corrupted, that hold images of Ariane smiling, Ariane reading, Ariane existing as more than a mission parameter or pilot designation. What we can infer from these fragments is a relationship that grew quietly in the margins of protocol. Ariane would have been trained for her role as a Penrose pilot, prepared psychologically and physically for long-term isolation and eventual death far from home. Elster would have been assigned to support mission objectives, to maintain ship systems, to ensure the success of the venture according to Eusan standards. But somewhere in the preparation, in the training simulations, in the weeks or months they spent together before launch, they stopped being simply pilot and support unit. They became something the nation had no category for. It could not have been easy. Ariane would have been socialized to view Replikas as sophisticated tools, useful but not truly equal. She would have been taught that forming emotional attachments to them was as absurd as loving a particularly reliable vehicle, and Elster, for her part, would have been created with the understanding that her purpose was service, that her existence was validated only through usefulness to human objectives. For them to see past these ingrained frameworks, to recognize each other as people worthy of care and worthy of love, required a kind of courage that the game never explicitly names but shows in every moment of their connection. Ariane's journey to becoming a Penrose pilot suggests something about her character. These missions were voluntary in the sense that one had to accept the assignment, but the kind of person who volunteers for a one-way trip into deep space is likely someone who feels they have little to lose, or little keeping them tied to the world they know. Based on what we can piece together from documents and memories, Ariane may have been someone isolated even before her mission, someone who did not fit comfortably into Eusan society's carefully prescribed roles. There are hints that she loved books, particularly forbidden books. The spectre that haunts the game's narrative space draws heavily from The King in Yellow, a collection of stories that is referenced as dangerous literature within the Eusan Nation. Ariane's connection to this text suggests a mind that sought out knowledge and experiences beyond what her society sanctioned. She was a reader, a dreamer, someone who looked at the stars, not as targets for national expansion, but as escapes, as possibilities. In Elster, she found someone who could share that looking. Replikas are created with full cognitive capabilities, and despite the nation's attempts to constrain their thoughts to approved parameters, they possess the same capacity for wonder and imagination as any biological human. Elster could read the books Ariane loved. They could discuss stories together. They could look at the same stars and see the same beauty, the same terrible distances, the same suggestion of something beyond the mundane horror of their regulated lives. The Penrose mission itself becomes a metaphor for their relationship, a journey together into unknown space, leaving behind everything familiar, with only each other for company and only death waiting at the end. But even in that grim framework, there was something they could control. They could choose how that ending would arrive. They could decide that when systems failed and supplies ran out, when there was nothing left but the slow suffocation of a dying ship, they would face it together and on their own terms. Elster's promise to Ariane carries weight throughout the story, though its exact nature is subject to interpretation. Based on what we can piece together, Elster promised to be there for Ariane when the end came, to ensure she would not die alone or in prolonged pain. Some interpretations suggest the promise was specifically about mercy killing when the time was right. Others believe it was simpler, a promise to never leave her, to always be together. The ambiguity matters, because the breaking of this promise, whatever its exact words, becomes the wound that reality cannot heal. This promise becomes the anchor point for everything that follows. It is the reason Elster cannot rest, the reason she continues to wake and search and struggle even when reality itself has become unstable. She made a promise, and she failed to keep it. Or perhaps she kept it too well. The exact sequence of events is deliberately obscured, but what becomes clear is that something went catastrophically wrong, and Ariane did not get the gentle ending she had been promised. The game shows us the Penrose 512, their ship, crashed or landed or somehow arrived at a facility called S-23 Sierpinski. How this happened is never fully explained, and the documents that might provide answers are corrupted, contradictory, or incomplete. What matters is that the journey that should have ended quietly in the dark ended instead in horror, in pain, in a breaking that affected not just two individuals but the fabric of reality around them. Some interpretations of the game's lore suggest that Ariane's death, when it came, was not peaceful. Perhaps she was injured in the crash or collision that brought them to Sierpinski. Perhaps she lingered in pain while Elster, damaged or separated, could not reach her. Perhaps she called out for help that did not come, for a companion who had promised to be there but was not. The exact details remain shrouded, but the emotional core is clear. The promise was broken, and that breaking had consequences beyond what either of them could have imagined. Ariane's suffering, her desperate desire for reunion with Elster, her refusal to let go even as death claimed her. These things should have ended with her body's final shutdown. But the facility they had reached was no ordinary place. S-23. Sierpinski was a research installation conducting experiments into something called bioresonance, a technology or phenomenon that involved consciousness, memory, and the thin boundaries between what is real and what is perceived. In her dying moments, or perhaps after her death, Ariane's consciousness, amplified by bioresonance technology, or by something even less comprehensible, began to affect reality itself. Her memories became infectious, spreading through the facility, rewriting the world according to her pain and longing. Her desire for Elster, for one more chance, for the promise to be fulfilled, became a gravitational force that pulled at time and space and the minds of everyone within range. This is where Signalis shifts from survival horror into something closer to cosmic horror. The game's reality is not trustworthy because it is being shaped by a dying or dead woman's desperate dreaming. The facility Elster explores is both real and a manifestation of Ariane's psyche, populated by Replikas who are simultaneously independent beings and echoes of Elster herself, fragments of her identity scattered across variations and possibilities. The corrupted Replikas that hunt Elster through Sierpinski's corridors are other LSTR units, other star units, other models that have been twisted by the breakdown of reality, but they are also manifestations of guilt, fear, and memory. They represent what Replikas become when the order that created them collapses, when the programming that constrained them breaks down, when they're left with only base directives and corrupted imperatives. They are tragic figures themselves, victims of a catastrophe they did not cause and cannot understand. Throughout Elster's journey, she encounters evidence of other iterations of herself, other attempts to reach Ariane, other loops where she woke up and tried to make things right. The game presents this through repeated imagery, through rooms that appear in impossible configurations, through corridors that lead back to themselves, through the unsettling realization that this has all happened before and will happen again. The Penrose mission's name takes on new meaning. This is the impossible staircase made manifest, a structure that climbs forever while going nowhere, where each step brings you back to where you began. The love between Elster and Ariane, which should have been a private thing, a small rebellion against an uncaring universe, has become the engine of a nightmare that traps everyone involved. Ariane cannot let go because she is waiting for Elster to fulfill the promise. Elster cannot rest because she knows she failed to be there when she was needed most, and caught. Between their codependent yearning is a reality that bends under the weight of emotions too strong to be contained by death. This is not romantic in the conventional sense. It is obsession and duty and grief twisted into something that perpetuates suffering. And yet, beneath the horror, the love remains real. Ariane waits because Elster is the only thing that ever made her feel less alone. Elster returns again and again because Ariane is the only thing that ever made her feel like more than a function. Their love is the wound and the reason for healing, the trap and the key to escape. The photographs scattered throughout the game serve as anchors to their shared past. Images of them together, captured in moments of normalcy that now seem impossibly distant. A picture of Ariane holding flowers, smiling softly, with Elster's form partially visible in the frame. Another of them in what might be a training facility, Ariane's hand reaching toward the camera, toward the viewer, toward us, toward the memory of a time when touch was simple and real. These photographs are more than nostalgia. They are evidence, proof that this love existed, that it was not imagined or hallucinated, that before the breaking there were two people who meant something to each other in a world that told them they could not and should not mean anything at all. The photographs are real in a way that much of what Elster experiences has ceased to be. Small islands of confirmed truth in an ocean of uncertainty. The game asks us to witness a love story told through its ending, through its inability to end properly. We see not the beginning or the middle, but the eternal recursive attempt to reach a conclusion that keeps slipping away. We see two beings who should have had their moment of peace, their chosen ending, their quiet death together in the dark. Instead, they got trapped in a loop of failed reunions, corrupted memories, and reality breaking under the strain of emotions that death could not contain. This is the tragedy of Elster and Ariane. Not that they loved, but that they loved in a universe that gave them no space for that love to exist healthily. Not that they suffered, but that their suffering could not end even when it should have. Not that they were separated, but that the separation became permanent and impermanent simultaneously, a Schrödinger's reunion where they are always about to reach each other and never quite do. Their story is a testament to the power of connection, and to its dangers when that connection cannot be released. It suggests that sometimes love is not enough, that wanting something desperately enough can make reality itself sick, that the refusal to let go, even when letting go is the kindest thing one could do, can create prisons more secure than any physical cell. And yet, for all its horror, for all the suffering it perpetuates, the love between Elster and Ariane remains the most human thing in Signalis. It is messy and imperfect and ultimately destructive, but it is real. It proves that even in a manufactured person and a dying pilot, there lives something that no nation could design and no ideology could suppress. The capacity to see another being and decide that they matter enough to promise them comfort, to offer them mercy, to refuse to abandon them even when abandonment would be sensible and safe. The game never judges them for this. It simply shows us what happens when love encounters forces it was never designed to withstand. Something went wrong. That simple statement contains multitudes of horror, spans impossible distances of suffering, encompasses the breakdown of everything that Elster and Ariane had planned and prepared for. Their mission should have been straightforward in its tragedy. Fly to a distant system, gather data, live as long as possible in cryosleep, then face their planned ending together. Instead, they arrived at S-23 Sierpinski, and nothing would ever be straightforward again. The Penrose 512 ship that carried them is found in the game, though found is perhaps the wrong word. It exists in states that seem to contradict each other, sometimes crashed, sometimes landed, sometimes present in ways that suggest it should not fit in the spaces it occupies. The ship itself has become unreliable, another victim of the reality corruption that permeates Sierpinski. Inside, we find evidence of the mission, personal effects, logs that may or may not be accurate, photographs pinned to walls in rooms that loop back on themselves. What happened during the approach to the facility is never clearly stated, and this ambiguity feels intentional. The game wants us to understand that the specifics matter less than the result. Something went catastrophically wrong. Perhaps there was a collision. Perhaps systems failed at a critical moment. Perhaps the facility's bioresonance experiments were already affecting local space, warping trajectories and perceptions. Perhaps Ariane's illness, hinted at in various documents, worsened at the worst possible time. What we know with more certainty is that Ariane ended up separated from Elster, injured or dying or already dead, and that her suffering created a wound in reality itself. The bioresonance technology being researched at Sierpinski dealt with the relationship between consciousness and physical reality, with the ways that thought and perception could affect material conditions. The implications are never fully spelled out, but what emerges from documents and environmental storytelling is a picture of experiments that pushed at the boundaries of what consciousness could do, what memory could preserve, what desire could manifest. Sierpinski was studying something dangerous, something that the Eusan Nation wanted to harness for purposes never entirely clear, but certainly not benevolent. The facility's name itself is a reference to a mathematical pattern, the Sierpinski triangle, a fractal that contains infinite iterations of itself within its structure, smaller and smaller triangles that never quite resolve into simplicity. It is a shape that suggests recursion, self-reference, patterns that repeat endlessly at different scales. How fitting for a place where time would begin to loop, where events would repeat with variations, where reality would fold in on itself like geometry made liquid. The research at Sierpinski seems to have involved Replikas, using their synthetic neural patterns as subjects for bioresonance experimentation. There are hints that the facility was trying to achieve something related to memory transfer, personality preservation, or consciousness backup. The Eusan Nation, always seeking perfect control, would certainly be interested in technologies that could preserve loyalty, transfer skills, or eliminate the inconvenience of training new units when experience could simply be copied from one neural substrate to another. But bioresonance proved less controllable than its researchers hoped. Consciousness is not a simple electrical pattern that can be copied like data on a drive. It is entangled with memory, with physical embodiment, with the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. When Sierpinski's experiments began to go wrong, when boundaries between minds started to blur, the results were catastrophic. Personnel began experiencing memories that were not theirs, seeing things that should not exist, responding to commands from voices only they could hear. The facility's logs document a slow collapse into chaos. Reports of equipment malfunction give way to reports of personnel acting strangely, which give way to reports that stop making sense, that contradict earlier reports, that seem to be written by people who are no longer sure who they are or what their reality is. The bureaucratic language struggles to contain what is happening, tries to fit madness into approved reporting formats, and ultimately fails. Into this already compromised environment came Ariane's suffering. Whether the bioresonance research made her consciousness particularly vulnerable or particularly powerful is unclear, but what happened when she died or began dying was a resonance cascade that rewrote the facility according to her trauma. Her memories became the dominant signal, overwhelming other minds, restructuring the physical space to reflect her psychological landscape, creating loops and repetitions as her dying thoughts circled endlessly around the same few images, the same few desires. The corruption spreads through multiple vectors. Physically, the facility begins to manifest impossible architectures, rooms that should not connect, spaces that fold in on themselves, corridors that lead to places they should not reach. Psychologically, The Replikas and any surviving humans find their own memories contaminated by Ariane's, seeing her past, feeling her emotions, losing their sense of individual identity as the boundaries between self and other break down. The Replikas of Sierpinski become hostile not through any programmed aggression, but as a response to the corruption. They are defending themselves against what they perceive as threats, but their perception has been so warped that threat and help become indistinguishable. They attack Elster when she returns because they see her as an intrusion, as wrong, as something that does not belong in the reality they now inhabit. Or perhaps they attack because they recognize her as the source of all this suffering, the one whose broken promise set everything in motion. Some of the corrupted Replikas seem to be stuck in loops of their own, repeating actions or phrases, unable to move beyond particular behaviors. They are like scratched records, skipping endlessly on the same groove. Their sophisticated minds reduced to simple patterns by damage they were never designed to process. Others seem to be aware of their corruption, of the wrongness of everything around them, and their attacks carry a desperate quality, as if they're trying to end something they know cannot end. The signal that Ariane's consciousness broadcasts is not malicious. It does not want to hurt anyone. It simply wants Elster. It wants the promise fulfilled. It wants reunion and peace and an end to suffering. But translated through bioresonance, amplified by technology meant to study consciousness and instead enslaved by it, that want becomes a gravitational force that warps everything nearby. The facility becomes a trap designed by desperate need, each room a reflection of Ariane's memories, each encounter a manifestation of her fear that Elster will not come, that the promise will remain broken forever. Elster, when she finally wakes or returns or manifests in this corrupted space, finds herself in a nightmare that is both familiar and alien. She recognizes elements of the ship she shared with Ariane, rooms that should be part of the Penrose 512. But they are wrong, stretched, combined with spaces from Sierpinski, infected with decay and biology that should not be there. The game's visual design brilliantly captures this sense of wrongness, of spaces that feel like they're rotting from the inside, of technology overgrown with organic matter that seems to pulse with its own rhythm. This is body horror and existential horror combined. The facility is dying the way a body dies, but it is also trapped the way a mind can be trapped, unable to move forward, unable to let go, caught in the moment of trauma and replaying it endlessly. Walls grow strange textures that might be rust, or might be dried blood, or might be something else entirely. Lights flicker with rhythms that suggest breathing. Sounds echo in ways that make you question whether they are mechanical failures or the moans of something that should not be capable of moaning. The descent into nightmare is both sudden and gradual. For Ariane, it must have happened in the horrible clarity of dying, the realization that Elster was not there, that the promise was broken, that she would face the end alone after all. For Elster, it happens through waking in a world that no longer makes sense, through realizing that she has failed in the one thing she swore to do, through understanding that somehow she's being given chances to make it right, but each chance seems to end in failure. For us, the players, the descent is a slow piecing together of what went wrong, a gradual understanding that the survival horror we're playing through is not about surviving physical threats, but about witnessing the aftermath of love that could not properly end. We are walking through the architectural manifestation of grief, fighting enemies that are symptoms of emotional breakdown given form, solving puzzles that are really about trying to make sense of a situation that transcends sense. The nightmare of Signalis is not that monsters chase you through corridors. It is that those corridors are memories, that those monsters are people who used to have names and purposes, that the whole structure you navigate is a prison built from the refusal or inability to let go. It is a nightmare where dying does not end suffering, where love becomes the fuel for horror, where the most intimate of human experiences, the connection between two people who chose to face death together, becomes the seed of something vast and terrible and sad. The facility itself is a character in Signalis, perhaps the most important character after Elster and Ariane. S-23. Sierpinski is where everything converges, where mission and experiment and love and death all collide and fuse into something new and terrible. It is a place that was already compromised before Ariane arrived, already conducting research that pushed at dangerous boundaries, already containing the seeds of catastrophe. Her arrival and suffering simply provided the catalyst for those seeds to bloom into nightmare. Sierpinski's architecture reflects the aesthetics of the Eusan Nation, brutalist, utilitarian, designed for function over comfort. Concrete corridors lit by industrial fluorescence, metal grates underfoot, control panels with analog displays and chunky buttons, the kind of space that declares its purpose through its refusal to be anything other than practical. But even before the corruption, there would have been something oppressive about the facility, something in its design that suggested isolation, disconnection from anything resembling warmth or humanity. The facility was officially a re-education and labour camp with mining operations, though it suggested that classified research involving bioresonance technology was also conducted there. S-23 Sierpinski extracted resources from Leng while using both Gestalt prisoners and Replika workers, all under the watchful eye of Aeon, the nation's security apparatus. The bioresonance research at Sierpinski seems to have explored how consciousness could influence physical reality, what the nation's documents describe as synchronistic phenomena, or the ability of the mind to alter the physical world. The technology was poorly understood even by those who used it. Colibri units, specialized bioresonance Replikas, could use it to stabilize the mental states of other units or amplify signals. Felk units, the commanders of Aeon facilities, possessed even stronger bioresonant abilities, described in some accounts as almost godlike in their capacity to control and influence others. These experiments were not undertaken for benevolent reasons. The Eusan Nation's interest in such technology would have been strategic and controlling. If Replika memories could be preserved and transferred, then the expense of training could be eliminated. Experience accumulated over lifetimes could be shared instantly, and the problematic aspects of individual personality could be smoothed away in the copying process. It was research aimed at making an already controlled population even more manageable, at turning consciousness itself into an industrial process. But the researchers at Sierpinski discovered or perhaps created something they could not control. Bioresonance, whatever its exact nature, proved to be less about mechanical transfer of data and more about the fundamental interconnection of conscious beings. When they pushed at the boundaries between minds, those boundaries began to dissolve in ways that could not be reversed or contained. Personnel began experiencing each other's memories, feeling each other's emotions, losing track of where one person ended and another began. The facility's logs document this breakdown with the calm language of bureaucracy gradually giving way to confusion and fear. Early reports note minor anomalies, slight discrepancies in memory reporting, instances of personnel claiming to have been places they could not have been. Later reports become more urgent, describing subjects who can no longer distinguish their own past from others, who respond to names that are not theirs, who seem to contain multiple personalities simultaneously without any of them being fully in control. Then there are the reports that seem to come from people who are no longer fully people, who have become something else, something that exists across multiple bodies or in no body at all, something that speaks with many voices or with silence that somehow conveys meaning. These reports are the most disturbing because they suggest that consciousness, when freed from its usual constraints, does not simply dissipate but evolves into something we have no framework for understanding. Some interpretations of the game's lore suggest that Ariane's bioresonant abilities, amplified by her suffering and the technology at Sierpinski, essentially transformed her into something like a dreaming god whose unconscious thoughts reshape reality. This reading draws parallels to Lovecraft's Azathoth, the blind idiot god whose dreams constitute reality itself. Whether this is literally true or metaphorical, the effect is similar. Ariane's consciousness, unable to die properly, broadcasts itself across the facility and perhaps beyond, rewriting the world according to her trauma, her memories, and her desperate need for Elster. The facility began to change. Physical space folded in on itself, creating loops and recursions that reflected Ariane's cyclical thinking as she died. Rooms from the Penrose ship manifested within Sierpinski's corridors, impossible but present, as if her memories of the ship were strong enough to make those spaces real even though they should have been light years away. Time itself became unreliable, events playing out in sequences that did not match their causal order. The past bleeding into the present, the future somehow already determined and yet still being written. The Replikas stationed at Sierpinski were particularly vulnerable to Ariane's signal. Their synthetic neural architecture, already the subject of bioresonance research, offered less resistance to consciousness invasion than biological minds might have. They began to carry Ariane's memories as if they were their own, to feel her emotions, to see the world through filters coloured by her experiences. Some lost themselves entirely in the flood of foreign consciousness. Others managed to maintain fragmentary identities, but found themselves acting on impulses and desires that were not originally theirs. LSTR units like Elster became particularly significant in this corrupted reality. Ariane's memories and desires centered on Elster, and every LSTR unit in the facility became, in some sense, a potential manifestation of the one she was calling for. The boundaries between individual LSTR units blurred. They might all be Elster, or none of them might be the Elster Ariane remembers, or perhaps Elster as a distinct individual no longer exists, having been shattered across multiple instances, each carrying fragments of the original personality. This uncertainty about identity becomes central to the game's exploration. When Elster wakes at the beginning of Signalis, is she the original Elster from the Penrose mission? Is she a copy? Is she one of many Elsters attempting the same task? The game never provides a definitive answer, and the absence of that answer is itself meaningful. In a world where consciousness can be transferred, copied and scattered across multiple substrates, the very question of which one is the real me becomes unanswerable. The facility also manifests more abstract horrors, things that seem to be expressions of Ariane's deteriorating mental state as she died. Organic growth spread through technological spaces, cables and wires becoming indistinguishable from veins and sinew. Eyes appear in walls, watching, always watching, as if the facility itself has gained some terrible form of awareness. The air itself sometimes seems to pulse with a rhythm like breathing, like a heartbeat, as if the entire structure has become a body struggling to stay alive. Certain areas of the facility serve as anchor points, places where the corruption is strongest or where key events occurred. These spaces loop back on themselves with particular intensity, forcing anyone who enters to relive moments again and again. A medical bay where Ariane may have been treated after the crash. A containment area where bioresonance subjects were kept. The hangar where the Penrose ship came to rest. Each of these locations carries a weight of significance, a density of memory that makes them more real than their surroundings, even as their reality bends under the strain of everything they contain. The other personnel who were at Sierpinski before the corruption become ghosts in multiple senses. Some are literally dead, their bodies found in various states of decay throughout the facility. Others may be alive but so altered by the bioresonance corruption that they no longer resemble who they were, and still others exist in states that blur the distinction between life and death, consciousness persisting in forms that should not be possible, trapped in the same recursive nightmare as everyone else. Among these figures are other Replikas, star units who were administrators, STCR units who provided security, colibri medical units, all of them now corrupted and hostile or simply broken, stuck in loops of behavior they cannot escape. They were people once, with thoughts and feelings and perhaps connections to each other. Now they are fragments, echoes, symptoms of a reality that has lost its coherence. A particularly confusing element involves Alina Seo, a name that appears alongside references to Elster's possible Gestalt origin, Lilith Itu. The game suggests Alina may have been connected to Ariane's past in some way, perhaps someone her mother knew, or she may be a projection created by Ariane's consciousness, a what-if version of her life where she never joined the Penrose program. The photograph showing Alina and Lilith together, and Elster's confusion about whether she's searching for Ariane or Alina, suggests that in the corrupted reality, identities blur and merge. Some interpretations even suggest that Falk, the facility commander, merged with Ariane through bioresonance, creating a composite being. The game's exploration of the facility is a journey through layered meanings. On the surface level, it is survival horror navigation, avoiding enemies, managing limited resources, solving environmental puzzles to progress. But beneath that is exploration as archaeology, piecing together what happened here from documents, from environmental details, from the stories told by corpses and ruined equipment. And beneath that is exploration as psychology, recognizing that every room and corridor is also a chamber in Ariane's dying mind, that the map of the facility is also a map of trauma. There are moments in Signalis where the facility seems almost to speak, where the arrangement of spaces or the pattern of corruption suggests intentionality. Perhaps this is Ariane trying to communicate, trying to guide Elster toward her. Or perhaps it is the building itself, infected with enough residual consciousness from all who have suffered and died within it, that it has developed something like awareness, something that wants resolution as desperately as its prisoners do. The red and white colour scheme that dominates the visual design speaks to this dual nature. White is the colour of sterility, of the nation's obsession with cleanliness and control. Red is the colour of urgency, of alarm, of blood. Together they create an aesthetic that is simultaneously clinical and visceral, suggesting both the cold rationality of the research conducted here and the warm horror of bodies breaking down, of life persisting in ways it should not. The revelation that Elster has been through this before, that she has woken and searched and failed and woken again, recontextualizes the entire experience of playing Signalis. What felt like a linear progression through a space reveals itself to be one iteration in an ongoing cycle, a loop that may have repeated countless times already and may repeat countless more. This is where the game's title takes on additional resonance. Signal is, after all, a repeating transmission, a message sent again and again in the hope that someone will receive it. The cycle is not a simple repeat. Each iteration carries forward traces of the previous ones, like echoes building on echoes until the sound becomes distorted and strange. Elster encounters evidence of her own past attempts, corpses of LSTR units in locations she has not yet reached, suggesting she died there in a previous loop. Notes written in her own hand that she does not remember writing. Equipment positioned in ways that only make sense if she had been there before to arrange it. This accumulation of iterations creates a palimpsest effect, where multiple versions of events exist simultaneously, none of them fully erased, all of them contributing to the present reality. The facility becomes a space haunted not just by the dead, but by the multiple deaths of the same individuals, by failed attempts that still somehow persist as scars in the fabric of reality. The mechanism driving the cycle seems to be Ariane's desire combined with bioresonance technology. Each time Elster fails to reach her or fails to provide the mercy that was promised, Ariane's suffering continues, and that suffering broadcasts outward, resetting conditions, drawing Elster back or creating a new Elster who will try again. It is not clear whether Ariane is aware of the cycle, whether she knows she is trapping Elster in this loop, or whether her consciousness has been so fragmented by pain and dying that she exists only as pure want, as need without awareness. For Elster, the cycle is torture, of a particular kind. She's compelled by her promise, by her love, by the core of who she is to keep trying. But each failure reinforces the original guilt, adds new trauma to old, creates layers of suffering that build on each other. She may not remember every previous iteration clearly, but the weight of them accumulates in her neural pathways, creating a sense of déjà vu, of exhaustion that has no clear source, of despair that feels older than this current attempt. There is particular horror in the idea that suffering can become structural, that pain can generate systems that perpetuate themselves indefinitely. The cycle in Signalis is such a system. It runs on Ariane's inability to let go and Elster's inability to give up, on the promise that binds them together even across death, on love that has become indistinguishable from obsession. Neither of them chose this exactly, yet both of them maintain it through their choices, through their refusal or inability to accept an ending that is not the one they planned. The game suggests that memory is what sustains the cycle. As long as Ariane remembers her need for Elster, as long as Elster remembers her promise, the loop continues. This implies that forgetting might be escape, that letting go of memory and identity could break the cycle. But this is a horrifying suggestion in its own way. To escape suffering through forgetting is not really escape. It is erasure. It is a kind of death that leaves the body functioning but removes the self, removes the very things that made the suffering matter in the first place. Some of the game's documents hint at previous attempts to break the cycle from outside, researchers or survivors trying to intervene, to stop the bioresonance cascade, to help Elster or Ariane move beyond their loop. These attempts always fail, usually catastrophically, adding new victims to the count, new sufferers trapped in subsidiary cycles of their own. The signal is too strong, the desire too fundamental, the corruption too deep. The wound that Ariane's dying created cannot be sealed from outside. It can only be addressed from within by the two people at its centre, But this creates an impossible situation. For Elster to reach Ariane requires navigating a facility that is simultaneously real and unreal, fighting through enemies who are simultaneously independent beings, and manifestations of Ariane's fears, solving puzzles that are simultaneously logical and psychologically symbolic. And even if she succeeds, even if she reaches Ariane's physical form or what remains of it, then what? The promise was to provide mercy, to end suffering. But ending Ariane's suffering might mean ending the signal that maintains the loop, which might mean Elster herself ceases to exist if she is only a manifestation of that signal. Or it might mean both of them finally dying, truly dying, together as they should have. The cycle reveals itself gradually through environmental storytelling and through moments of realization that the player experiences alongside Elster. A room that seems familiar, even though this is supposedly the first time entering it. A code that Elster somehow knows without being told. A pathway that feels like it has been walked before, and then the discovery that it has by an Elster who is both the same and different, who walked this same path and died somewhere ahead. These moments of recognition are some of the game's most effective horror, not because of jump scares or sudden violence, but because of the slow, dawning understanding that escape may not be possible, that this struggle might be eternal, that the search for Ariane might never end because the ending itself is what the loop cannot allow. Every success might simply be a prelude to waking again, starting over, trying once more with slightly different variables but the same fundamental impossibility. The cycle also raises questions about identity and continuity that the game never fully resolves. If Elster dies and wakes again, is the new Elster the same person? She has the same memories, the same purpose, the same love and guilt. But she is in a new body, or a new instance of the same body. Is consciousness continuous if it is interrupted by death? Is the self preserved if it can be restarted from backup? These are questions that matter intensely to Replikas, whose existence is already uncertain in terms of how their society values them. If they can be copied, if their consciousness can be transferred or recreated, does that make them more or less real? For Ariane, trapped in her dying or death, the cycle might be experienced as a single extended moment, time having lost its meaning for her. From her perspective, if she has a coherent perspective, Elster might be both always coming and never arriving, both present and absent simultaneously. The corruption of reality around her might be her attempt to collapse that distance, to bring Elster to her across whatever gaps separate them, across space and time and the boundary between life and death. The tragedy is that the cycle itself prevents the resolution it seeks. By continually resetting Elster's attempts, by never allowing a definitive ending, Ariane's suffering is perpetuated rather than relieved. The mechanism designed to bring them together keeps them apart, separated by attempts that fail, and reset and fail again. It is a perfect trap, fed by the very emotions that should lead to escape, sustained by love that should lead to peace, but instead leads only to more suffering. Breaking the cycle requires accepting something that both Elster and Ariane struggle with, that the promise, as originally made, cannot be fulfilled. Circumstances changed. The ending they planned became impossible. The gentle death together in the dark was replaced by this nightmare. To move forward requires accepting a different ending, perhaps one that is less gentle, less together, less like what was promised. It requires letting go of the original plan and embracing whatever resolution is actually possible given what has happened. This is the emotional core that the cycle obscures and reveals simultaneously. The loop is a refusal to accept that things cannot be as they were supposed to be. It is a desperate clinging to a promise made in simpler times, before corruption and horror and the breaking of reality. It is understandable and human and tragic because it perpetuates the very suffering it seeks to end. Sometimes love means letting go. Sometimes keeping a promise means breaking it. Sometimes the kindest thing is to accept that the ending you planned is not the ending you will get. Signalis does not create its horror in isolation. It draws deeply from existing wells of cosmic horror literature, particularly from Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow, a collection of stories published in 1895 that has influenced horror fiction ever since. The game's references to this text are not casual or decorative. They're structural, woven into the very fabric of what the story's about and how it functions. The King in Yellow features a fictional play that drives those who read or watch it to madness. The play itself is never fully described in Chambers' stories, only referenced and excerpted in fragments, but its effects are clear. Those who engage with it too deeply lose their grip on reality, succumbing to obsessions and delusions, sometimes committing acts of violence or self-destruction. The play is a kind of mimetic hazard, a story that infects its audience, that cannot be safely consumed. In Signalis, this concept is transplanted into the world of the Eusan Nation, where The King in Yellow exists as forbidden literature, dangerous text that the state has banned for reasons that seem initially ideological but that take on darker implications. Ariane's connection to this book suggests she was drawn to forbidden knowledge, to art that the nation deemed too dangerous to allow. But the game suggests that perhaps the nation was right to fear it, not because it threatens their authority, but because it genuinely can cause harm, because some stories carry infections that spread from mind to mind. The colour yellow itself becomes a motif throughout Signalis, appearing in warning signs, in corrupted technology, in the visual glitches that suggest reality breaking down. It is the colour of caution, of quarantine, of something that should not be approached. In the context of The King in Yellow, it is also the colour of madness, of transformation, of the court of a monarch who rules over a realm that might be hallucination or might be more real than the waking world. The game never shows us the King in Yellow play directly, maintaining the same strategy as Chambers. The horror is more effective when glimpsed obliquely, when suggested rather than stated. But the effects of the play mirror what happens at Sierpinski. Reality becomes unreliable. People lose their sense of self. Obsessions take hold and cannot be released. The boundaries between fiction and reality blur until the distinction becomes meaningless. This suggests a reading where Ariane's love for the book, her repeated engagement with its stories, made her particularly vulnerable to the kind of consciousness corruption that bioresonance could inflict. Perhaps she'd already begun to lose herself in the play's narrative before the mission even began. Perhaps her connection to Elster, beautiful as it was, carried from the start seeds of the obsession that would eventually consume reality itself. Or perhaps the point is that all stories are dangerous, that any narrative we invest ourselves in deeply enough can reshape our perception of reality. The King in Yellow is just the most obvious example, the story that wears its danger openly. But every story we love, every fiction we return to, every narrative we use to understand our lives has the potential to trap us if we cannot maintain distance, if we cannot remember that we are separate from the tales we tell. The play features locations like Carcosa, a mysterious city in Lake Harley, a body of water associated with the king's domain. These places exist in the fiction, but seem to have some reality beyond it. as if the play describes real locations that pre-exist the text. Signalis adopts a similar approach with Sierpinski and the Penrose ship. They are real places, but they have also become fictional, infected by story, transformed into spaces that no longer follow physical law, but follow instead the logic of narrative and dream. Chambers' work is part of a larger tradition of cosmic horror, the genre pioneered by writers like H.P. Lovecraft, where the fundamental conceit is that reality is far stranger and more hostile than human minds can safely comprehend. Coming into contact with the true nature of the cosmos drives people mad not through any intentional malice, but simply because human consciousness is not equipped to process such knowledge. We are insects trying to understand concepts that require divine perspective, and the attempt breaks us. Signalis inherits this cosmic horror framework but personalizes it. The incomprehensible force at the center of the story is not some alien god or abstract cosmic principle. It is love and grief amplified beyond human scale by technology that was never meant to touch such things. The horror comes not from encountering something inhuman, but from encountering something profoundly human that has been made vast and terrible by circumstances beyond anyone's control. This is perhaps more frightening than traditional cosmic horror. Cthulhu, in Lovecraft's stories, is alien and unknowable. We cannot relate to it, and its indifference to humanity is almost comforting in its completeness. But the horror at the center of Signalis is relatable. We understand love, we understand loss, we understand the desire to keep promises, to not let the people we care about suffer. These are familiar human emotions. Seeing them twisted into something that destroys reality makes them no less familiar but infinitely more terrifying. The game suggests that perhaps all horror is cosmic horror if we look at it from the right angle. The death of someone we love is, for us, the end of a universe. The betrayal of a promise is, for those involved, a fundamental breakdown of reality. Scale is relative. What seems small and personal from a distance is all-consuming when we're inside it. Ariane and Elster's tragedy might affect only a single facility, might be invisible to the wider galaxy. But for them, and for everyone caught in their orbit, it is the only thing that matters, the only reality that remains. The King in Yellow serves as a mirror for the player as well. We're engaging with a story about stories that consume their audience. We are playing a game about characters trapped in loops, while we the players may replay the game multiple times, willingly entering the cycle, seeking different endings, different interpretations. Are we so different from Ariane? Returning again and again to a narrative that moves us, that hurts us, that we cannot let go of. The cosmic horror elements in Signalis work because they are not abstract. They are grounded in emotion, in character, in specific relationships and specific failures. The universe is not indifferent to Elster and Ariane. It is actively hostile, bent by their own feelings into a shape that traps them. This is worse than indifference. This is reality itself becoming a prison constructed from their own psychology. And like the King in Yellow, Signalis leaves much unexplained, much suggested rather than stated. We never get a complete picture of what happened. We never fully understand the bioresonance technology or how it functions. We never learn the full extent of the Eusan Nation's experiments or why Sierpinski was conducting them. These gaps are not flaws but features. They are the spaces where cosmic horror lives, in the uncertainty, in the sense that there are answers but they might be more disturbing than the questions. The game invites us to piece together meaning from fragments, to construct our own understanding of events from incomplete evidence, and in doing so it makes us complicit in the horror. We're creating the narrative that frightens us. We're choosing how to interpret ambiguous information. Like readers of The King in Yellow play, we engage with the story at our own risk, knowing that understanding it fully might require accepting things about love, about identity, about consciousness that are not comfortable or safe. Signalis tells its story as much through what it shows as what it says, perhaps more through silence than speech. The game trusts its audience to interpret, to make connections, to understand that sometimes the most important truths cannot be spoken directly. This approach to narrative creates a different kind of engagement, one where the player becomes an active participant in meaning-making rather than a passive recipient of exposition. The visual language of the game is dense with symbolism. Colours carry weight. The red and white aesthetic suggests both clinical sterility and visceral violence, both the nation's obsession with purity and the blood that purity requires. The recurring image of eyes, both mechanical and organic, speaks to surveillance, to being watched by forces that may or may not be malevolent, to the horror of being seen when you wish to remain hidden, or not being seen when you desperately need recognition. Flowers appear throughout the game, particularly red lilies, which in various cultural contexts symbolize passion, death, and remembrance. The photographs Elster finds show Ariane holding flowers, a gesture of life and growth in a world increasingly defined by decay. The flowers become markers of memory, of moments when beauty was possible, before everything collapsed into horror. Their presence in the corrupted facility is almost defiant, as if Ariane's memories insist that gentleness existed once, and cannot be entirely erased by what came after. The game's use of analog technology is not just aesthetic, but thematic. Cathode ray tube monitors, magnetic tape drives, physical switches and dials, all of these belong to an era before digital seamlessness, an era when information storage was tangible and visible. This creates a world where memory has physical form, where recording is an act of deliberate preservation rather than automatic backup. When tapes are corrupted or documents are damaged, the loss is visible, material, irreversible in ways that digital corruption might not be. The cramped, claustrophobic spaces of both the Penrose ship and Sierpinski facility speak to the constrained existence of those who inhabit them. There is no room for expansion, no space to escape into. Every corridor is narrow. Every room is just barely large enough for its function. This physical constraint mirrors the emotional and existential constraints the characters face. Manufactured people in a manufactured world, following prescribed paths with only the smallest spaces for individuality or choice. Water appears in various forms throughout the game, pooling in corners, dripping from ceilings, sometimes rising to flood entire sections. Water is transformation, dissolution, the breaking down of boundaries. It can cleanse or it can drown. In the context of Signalis, water seems to represent the fluid nature of reality under bioresonance corruption, the way solid certainties become liquid and unstable, the way consciousness can flow from one vessel to another. Mirrors and reflective surfaces are notably absent or broken, suggesting fractured identity, the inability to see oneself clearly. The question of what reflection would even mean for beings who might be copies of copies. When Elster does encounter her reflection, it is often distorted or shows someone who is simultaneously her and not her, a reminder that identity in this world is never singular or certain. The game's sparse dialogue is itself a form of storytelling. Characters speak rarely, and when they do, their words are often fragmented, unclear or contradictory. This reflects the corruption of communication, the difficulty of expressing truth when reality itself is unstable, and the isolation that comes from being unable to trust language to convey meaning. Silence becomes more trustworthy than speech, and understanding comes from observation rather than explanation. Environmental details tell stories that dialogue never could. An abandoned meal half-eaten on a table suggests sudden interruption. Personal effects arranged carefully in a locker speak to someone who expected to return. Bloodstains in patterns that suggest struggle or surrender. Equipment damaged in ways consistent with panic rather than combat. Each room is a paragraph in a larger story, and reading that story requires attention to what is present and what is conspicuously absent. The game's use of text is equally deliberate. Documents scattered throughout the facility provide context and background, but they are often corrupted, censored, or incomplete. Words are redacted. Sentences trail off mid-thought. Reports contradict each other. This fragmentation mirrors the fragmentation of memory and reality, suggesting that complete understanding is impossible, that we can only ever have pieces of the truth, and that those pieces may not fit together in any coherent way. Certain images recur throughout the game with variations, suggesting that they hold particular significance in Ariane's memory or psyche. The Penrose ship's interior appears again and again, sometimes accurately rendered and sometimes impossibly distorted. A specific arrangement of furniture or equipment, a particular angle of view. These repetitions are like refrains in music, returning to emphasize importance, to mark emotional weight. The game's sound design contributes to its symbolism, the hiss of static, the hum of malfunctioning equipment, the distant sound of something that might be machinery or might be breathing. Audio in Signalis is often ambiguous, leaving the player uncertain whether they heard something significant or merely a random noise. This uncertainty extends to voice, to whether the whispers that seem to come from empty rooms are real communications or auditory hallucinations. Light and shadow play crucial roles in establishing mood and meaning. The flickering of failing fluorescence creates strobing effects that make movement uncertain, that hide and reveal in rapid succession. Darkness is not just absence of light, but presence of unknown, of space that might contain anything. And when light does penetrate, it often does so in ways that feel harsh or revealing, illuminating things that were perhaps better left unseen. The game's refusal to explain itself directly is an act of respect toward its audience. It trusts that players can handle ambiguity, can sit with uncertainty, can construct meaning from fragments. This makes Signalis a game that rewards attention and thought, that becomes richer on subsequent playthroughs as details previously missed reveal themselves, as connections become apparent, as the full scope of the tragedy emerges from its careful arrangement of symbols and silence. Signalis offers multiple endings, each one a different answer to the question of how this nightmare might resolve. These endings are not simply variations on a theme, but fundamentally different philosophical positions on what it means to end suffering, to keep promises, to love someone when that love has become destructive. The game does not declare one ending correct and others wrong. Instead, it presents choices and allows the player to decide which tragedy they can accept. The promise ending, often considered the most complete or true ending, requires the player to find specific items and make specific choices throughout the game. In this ending, Elster reaches Ariane and fulfills the original promise, providing the mercy killing that was supposed to happen years ago, the gentle death that circumstances prevented. After so many loops, so many failed attempts, Elster finally succeeds in ending Ariane's suffering, and in doing so, she ends the cycle. This ending is beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure. The final moments show Elster and Ariane together, the promise kept at last, the suffering concluded. There is a sense of release, of finally being able to rest. The visual presentation suggests peace, a quiet fading rather than violent cessation. For all the horror that led to this moment, the moment itself is tender, a remembrance of what they meant to each other before everything went wrong. But this ending is also deeply sad because it means accepting death as the only escape, accepting that there is no future for them, no possibility of healing or recovery. The love between them, which should have been a source of joy, becomes the mechanism of their mutual destruction. The promise that defined their relationship becomes the instrument of its ending. To reach this conclusion is to acknowledge that sometimes love is not enough, that sometimes the kindest thing we can do for those we care about is to help them stop existing. The promise ending also implies the end of Elster's existence, if she is a manifestation of the bioresonance signal, a projection of Ariane's desperate need. Then when Ariane dies truly and finally, Elster may cease to be. The fulfillment of the promise is simultaneously Elster's purpose and her termination. She exists to do this one thing, and when it is done, there is no more reason for her to continue. It is sacrifice absolute, the giving up of self to provide peace to another. The memory ending presents a different resolution. Instead of ending Ariane's life, Elster chooses to stay with her, to remain in the corrupted reality, to accept the loop rather than break it. This ending suggests that perhaps existence together, even in suffering, is preferable to separation through death. It prioritizes connection over release, choosing ongoing struggle over final peace. This ending can be read as either romantic or tragic depending on perspective. From one angle, it is the ultimate expression of devotion. Elster refusing to leave Ariane even when leaving would end both of their suffering. Love as commitment absolute, as the choice to share pain rather than escape it alone. From another angle, it is the perpetuation of horror, the refusal to accept necessary endings, the transformation of love into a trap that neither can escape. The memory ending might also represent Elster's inability to complete the promise, a failure that dooms both of them to continue the cycle. Perhaps in this version, Elster cannot bring herself to end Ariane's life, cannot perform that final act of mercy despite knowing it is what Ariane needs. The loop continues because the promise remains broken, because love becomes an impediment to the very kindness it should enable. The artifact ending presents a bleaker resolution. In this version, Elster never reaches Ariane, or reaches her too late, or in such damaged condition that reunion is meaningless. The cycle may continue, or it may end without proper closure. This ending emphasizes the tragedy of failed connection, of love that cannot overcome the obstacles placed before it, of promises that remain forever broken despite all efforts to repair them. This ending might be the most realistic in a terrible way. Not every story gets resolution. Not every journey reaches its destination. Sometimes we fail the people we love despite our best efforts. Sometimes circumstances are simply too overwhelming and good intentions are not enough. The artifact ending does not provide catharsis or even clear understanding. It simply stops, leaving both characters and players in a state of unresolved anguish. There are other endings and variations, some more obscure, some requiring very specific player choices. Each offers a slightly different lens through which to view the tragedy, a different emphasis on which elements of the story matter most. Some endings focus on Elster's identity and whether she is real or a copy. Others emphasize the facility and what it represents. Still others center on the nature of consciousness and memory. The existence of multiple endings is itself thematically significant. It suggests that there is no single truth, no one correct interpretation of what happened or what it means. Different players will see different aspects of the story as most important, will make different choices based on their own understanding and values. The game honors this by allowing those different perspectives to coexist, by refusing to declare definitively which ending represents the true resolution. This multiplicity also mirrors the loop structure within the game's narrative. Each ending is another iteration, another attempt to resolve the unresolvable. Players who seek all endings are participating in the same kind of cyclical behavior as Elster, returning again and again to the same story, hoping for a different outcome, unable to let go even when they know what awaits them. The game's structure makes us complicit in the very patterns it depicts. Choosing an ending in Signalis is choosing what kind of tragedy you can accept. Do you believe that love sometimes requires letting go, even when that means death? That is the promise ending. Do you believe that staying together matters more than ending suffering? That is the memory ending. Do you believe that sometimes we simply fail despite our best efforts? That is the artifact ending. None of these are wrong. All of them are true to different aspects of human experience. The game's refusal to provide a happy ending is crucial to its integrity. These characters have suffered too much. The corruption has gone too deep. The damage is too fundamental to be easily repaired. A happy ending would feel false, would betray the weight of everything that came before. Instead, the game offers endings that honor the tragedy, while providing different kinds of closure, different answers to the question of what it means to finally stop. What all the endings share is a sense of finality that the loop denies. Whether through death, through acceptance, or through failure, they represent moments when the cycle breaks, when the signal finally stops broadcasting, when the search ends one way or another. After so much repetition, after so many iterations, there is something almost peaceful in the idea of an ending at all, regardless of what that ending contains. Beneath its surface narrative of survival horror and tragic love, Signalis explores questions about identity, consciousness, memory, and what it means to be a person. These themes are not presented as abstract philosophy but as lived experience, as questions that the characters must navigate while dealing with immediate threats and overwhelming emotions. The question of identity is central to the Replika existence. If you are manufactured, if your personality was designed rather than developed organically, if you can be copied or replaced, what makes you a specific individual rather than just an instance of a type? The game suggests that identity is not found in origin but in continuity of experience, in the accumulation of memories and choices that make each being unique even if they started from the same template. Elster is an LSTR unit, but she is also Elster specifically, shaped by her relationship with Ariane, by the promise she made, by everything she has experienced across countless loops. Even if there are or were other LSTR units with similar programming, none of them are her because none of them have her history. Identity, the game suggests, is not what you are made of, but what you have lived through. This becomes more complex when we consider that Elster might be a copy, that the original Elster might have died in some earlier iteration and the current one is a reconstruction, or a different LSTR unit carrying forward the original's memories and purpose. Does this make her less real? The game seems to answer no. If she has the memories, if she feels the connection to Ariane, if she carries the weight of the promise, then she is Elster in every way that matters. Memory is presented as both treasure and prison. For Elster, memory of Ariane and their time together is what gives her purpose, what drives her forward, what makes her more than a simple machine. But memory is also what traps her in the cycle, what prevents her from simply ceasing operation and finding peace in nothingness. To remember is to remain bound to what was, unable to move into what might be. Ariane's memory, amplified through bioresonance, becomes a force that reshapes reality. Her inability to let go of her memories, her clinging to the promise and the relationship and the planned ending, creates the entire nightmare. Memory here is not passive storage but active force, consciousness that continues to exert influence even after the body that generated it has ceased to function properly. The game raises questions about whether memory is trustworthy. Elster's memories may be corrupted by the bioresonance field, influenced by Ariane's broadcasting consciousness, or simply degraded through damage and repetition. Documents and evidence contradict each other. What feels like memory might be implanted false recollection. The unreliability of memory creates uncertainty about everything, suggesting that perhaps we can never truly know our own past, that the stories we tell about ourselves are always partly fiction. Consciousness itself is revealed as more fluid and strange than everyday experience suggests. The bioresonance experiments at Sierpinski demonstrate that boundaries between minds are not as solid as we typically assume. Consciousness can bleed from one person to another, can be broadcast like a signal, can exist in states that we have no framework for understanding. This has profound implications for what it means to be an individual, to have a self distinct from others. If consciousness can be transmitted, copied, or shared, then perhaps the self is not a singular entity, but a pattern that can exist in multiple instances simultaneously. This would explain how Elster can be both herself and an echo of many previous Elsters, how Ariane can be both dead and still broadcasting, how the corrupted Replikas can carry fragments of identities that are not originally theirs. The self becomes a song that can be played on different instruments, similar but never quite identical. The relationship between love and obsession is explored with uncomfortable honesty. Ariane and Elster's love for each other is genuine and beautiful, but it is also the source of tremendous suffering. Their inability to let go of each other, their refusal to accept endings that are not the ones they planned, transforms love into a destructive force. The game does not condemn them for this, but it does show the consequences clearly. This suggests that love, for all its beauty, can become unhealthy when it refuses to adapt to changed circumstances, when it demands specific outcomes regardless of cost. True love, the game might be suggesting, includes the willingness to let go when holding on causes more harm than good. The greatest expression of love might be not in staying together at all costs, but in accepting separation when separation is necessary for peace. The theme of resistance through remembering is particularly poignant for the Replikas. In a society that treats them as disposable, that can erase and rewrite their memories, the act of maintaining individual memory becomes rebellion. To remember who you are, to remember the people you have cared about, to hold on to experiences that make you unique. This is resistance against a system that wants you to be generic and replaceable. Elster's determination to remember Ariane, to honour the promise made, to maintain her sense of self across loops and deaths and corruptions, is an act of defiance against everything the Eusan Nation designed her to be. She should be loyal to the nation. Instead, she is loyal to one person. She should accept her own disposal and replacement without complaint. Instead, she fights to continue existing as herself. She should follow her programming. Instead, she follows her heart. The game also explores the horror of existing without purpose. Replikas are created with specific functions, and their sense of self is often tied to their ability to perform those functions. When the facility collapses and normal operations cease, when the corrupted Replikas can no longer fulfill their designated roles, they become lost, desperate, sometimes violent. Purpose is what gives meaning to existence, and without it, consciousness becomes suffering without direction. This raises questions about whether purpose needs to be assigned from outside, or whether beings can create their own meaning. Elster finds purpose in her promise to Ariane, a self-chosen obligation that supersedes her designed function. This self-created purpose sustains her through horrors that would break someone who relied only on external validation. The game suggests that authentic purpose comes from within, from commitments we make to things and people we care about rather than from roles assigned by authorities. The political dimensions of the story, while not foregrounded, are present throughout. The Eusan Nation is a totalitarian state that has achieved terrifying levels of control through the manufacturing of consciousness itself. The game shows how such systems dehumanize both those they explicitly categorize as property and those they nominally recognize as citizens. Everyone under the nation's rule is constrained, everyone's life is prescribed, everyone exists to serve functions determined by others. Yet even in this perfectly controlled system, love emerges. Two beings who should have remained in their assigned roles instead formed a connection that defied all design and doctrine. This is simultaneously hopeful and tragic. Hopeful because it suggests that human connection cannot be entirely eliminated even by the most sophisticated systems of control. Tragic because that connection finds no space to exist healthily and instead becomes the seed of nightmare. The themes of Signalis are dark but not nihilistic. The game acknowledges suffering, acknowledges that sometimes there are no good solutions, acknowledges that love and memory and consciousness can all become sources of pain. But it also insists that these things matter, that they have value even when they hurt us, that the capacity to remember and feel and care is what makes existence meaningful, even when that meaning comes with terrible cost. We arrive at the end of our journey through Signalis, though perhaps end is the wrong word for a story so concerned with loops and cycles and the impossibility of true conclusion. We have walked through the ruins of a facility corrupted by grief, through the layers of a narrative that refuses to explain itself completely, through the tragic dimensions of a love that could not be contained by death, or distance, or the breaking of reality itself. What makes Signalis remarkable is not any single element but the way everything combines into a coherent emotional experience. The retrofuturistic aesthetic is not just visual style but world-building that speaks to constraint and surveillance. The survival horror gameplay is not just mechanical challenge but metaphor for navigating trauma and impossible choices. The fragmented narrative is not just artistic choice but necessary approach for a story about memories that cannot be trusted and reality that cannot be verified. The game trusts silence. It trusts that you will understand what Elster feels when she finds a photograph without needing a monologue about loss. It trusts that the horror of the Replika's existence will be apparent from environmental details without requiring speeches about rights and personhood. It trusts that the weight of a broken promise will resonate without extensive explanation of why promises matter. This silence is respectful. It treats its audience as intelligent, capable of making connections, able to sit with ambiguity without demanding everything be spelled out. In an era where many games over-explain their narratives, where every emotional beat is underlined and every theme explicitly stated, Signalis stands apart by leaving space for interpretation, for thought, for the player to become a co-author of meaning. The tragedy at the heart of Signalis is universal despite its specific science fiction trappings. We may not be synthetic beings created in factories, but we all grapple with questions of identity, with whether we are defined by our origins or our choices. We may not have access to bioresonance technology, but we all understand how loss can make reality feel unreal, how grief can create loops we cannot escape. We may not be trapped in literal cycles of death and resurrection, but we all know the experience of repeating patterns, of trying again and again to fix something that perhaps cannot be fixed. Elster and Ariane's story resonates because it is, beneath all the horror and science fiction, a story about two people who tried to face death together and found that even the simplest human desires can become impossibly complicated. They wanted to be together. They wanted to avoid suffering. They wanted to honour a promise. These are not exotic wants. They are fundamental, relatable, heartbreakingly ordinary. And the game shows us how even these ordinary desires can generate extraordinary horror when circumstances align in the worst possible ways. The love between them is real. That is important to recognise. For all the ways their connection becomes destructive, for all the suffering it perpetuates, it begins and remains grounded in genuine care. They see each other as people worthy of love in a world that tells them such seeing is impossible or forbidden. That recognition, that choice to value each other beyond assigned roles is beautiful even as its consequences are terrible. Signalis asks us to witness suffering without looking away, to acknowledge the ways that love and pain intertwine, to sit with the uncomfortable truth that sometimes there are no good solutions. It does not offer easy answers or comfortable resolutions. Instead, it presents a situation where every choice leads to tragedy and asks us to decide which tragedy we can accept. This is more honest than many stories dare to be. The game's use of cosmic horror elements is effective precisely because it makes the cosmic personal. The reality warping effects of bioresonance are terrifying not as abstract concepts, but as the specific mechanism that turns Ariane's dying wish into everyone's nightmare. The loops and recursions are horrifying not as mathematical impossibilities, but as the lived experience of people who cannot escape their own worst moments. The corruption of consciousness is disturbing not as science fiction speculation, but as metaphor for how trauma reshapes our inner worlds. What stays with you after playing Signalis is not any particular image or revelation, but an atmosphere, a feeling, a sense of having witnessed something profound and sad. The game creates a mood of melancholic horror, of beauty decayed, of love persisting in circumstances that make it indistinguishable from torment. This emotional residue is the mark of effective art. It lingers, it resonates, it makes you think about what you experience long after the screen goes dark. The game also prompts reflection on our own relationship with memory and identity. How much of who we are is determined by what we remember? If our memories changed, would we still be ourselves? What obligations do we have to past versions of ourselves, to promises we made in different contexts? These are not just questions for synthetic beings in science fiction settings. They are questions we all face whenever we grow and change, whenever we must decide whether to honour old commitments or adapt to new realities. Signalis demonstrates the power of independent game development to explore ideas and emotions that larger, more commercial projects might shy away from. Its willingness to be difficult, to refuse easy answers, to trust its audience with complexity and ambiguity, results in an experience that respects players as capable of engaging with challenging material. This is a game that could only exist as an independent work, free from market pressures to sand down its rough edges, or explain away its mysteries. The game's influences are worn openly, from survival horror classics to cosmic horror literature to the visual language of retrofuturism and totalitarian aesthetics. But these influences are synthesized into something new, something that honors its inspirations while establishing its own identity. Signalis is in conversation with its predecessors, building on what they achieved while adding its own voice to ongoing discussions about horror, about identity, about love. In the end, Signalis is a ghost story. It is haunted by the past, by promises broken and kept, by people who should have died but persist in forms both terrible and touching. Elster is a ghost searching for another ghost through a facility that is itself the ghost of what it once was. Everything is memory, echo, repetition. And like all good ghost stories, it is ultimately about how the past refuses to stay buried, how the dead continue to exert influence on the living, how some stories demand to be told even when their telling brings pain. The silence of Signalis speaks loudest in its spaces between words, in its refusal to fully explain, in its trust that emotional truth can be conveyed through atmosphere and suggestion as effectively as through exposition. The game understands that sometimes the most powerful horror is the horror we imagine for ourselves, the connections we make, the implications we recognize without being told. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you will think of Elster walking through endless corridors, searching for someone who is both always present and forever out of reach. Perhaps you will think of Ariane, waiting in darkness, her consciousness a signal that broadcasts hope and despair in equal measure. Perhaps you will think of the facility itself, a space where love became horror, and horror became the only form love could take. Their story is not ours, but it touches something in us that recognizes its truth. The fear of failing those we love, the desire to keep impossible promises, the hope that death might be gentle rather than cruel, the terror that suffering might continue beyond all reasonable bounds. These are familiar fears dressed in unfamiliar circumstances, made strange through science fiction but no less resonant for their strangeness. Signalis reminds us that stories do not need to explain everything to be meaningful, that silence can carry as much weight as words, that the spaces between what is shown and what is suggested can be where the deepest truths reside. It is a game that earns its ambiguities through emotional honesty, that justifies its mysteries through thematic coherence, that proves that sometimes the quietest voices speak the loudest. In the tragic silence of Signalis, in its refusal to shout its meanings or spell out its truths, there is respect. Respect for its characters, whose suffering is presented without exploitation or spectacle. Respect for its audience, trusted to engage thoughtfully with complex material. Respect for its influences, honoured through homage rather than imitation. And respect for the medium of games itself, demonstrating what interactive storytelling can achieve when it embraces ambiguity and atmosphere over explanation and action. So let the silence settle. Let the images fade like signals from distant stations still broadcasting though no one remains to listen. Let the story rest, though rest is perhaps impossible for narratives so concerned with endless cycles. Elster will continue her search. Ariane will continue waiting. The facility will continue its slow decay, trapped between states, neither fully present nor fully past. And we, having witnessed their tragedy, carry it forward in our own memories. We become part of the signal, another iteration in the endless loop of story retold and reinterpreted. We close our eyes and see corridors we've never walked, feel the weight of promises we have never made, hear the echo of voices speaking in languages of loss and longing. This is the gift Signalis offers, not answers but questions, not comfort but understanding, not escape from horror but the courage to witness it, to acknowledge it, to recognize in its extreme manifestations the shadows of our own fears, and loves and impossible desires. The night closes in, the signal fades, and somewhere in the dark between stars, two beings reach for each other across distances that cannot be measured in light years or kilometers, only in the immeasurable space between what was promised and what was possible. Rest now, the story is told, the silence speaks, and in that speaking perhaps there is a kind of peace. Good night.